The first time Julia Townsend truly understood what a man was made of. It was not when he drew his pistol or held his ground against three armed riders on a dusty road. It was the quiet, unhesitating moment he pressed his last biscuit into her cold hands and turned away without a single word, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to go hungry so that she would not. That moment came in the autumn of 1873, somewhere between Fort Dodge and the endless brown horizon of the Kansas plains, when the wind had teeth and the trail felt like it stretched all the way to the edge of creation. But to understand how Julia Townsend came to be on that trail, cold and hungry and half desperate, it is necessary to go back to where her story truly began, in the cramped, smoke-stained office of a land agent in St. Louis, Missouri, where a woman of 24 years stood before a map of the Western Territories with nothing but a leather satchel, $32, and the kind of stubborn courage that either gets a person killed or makes them extraordinary. Julia had not always been alone. 6 months prior, her father, Thomas Townsend, had passed from a fever that swept through their neighborhood near the river district with ruthless efficiency. Her mother had gone years before that, when Julia was still small enough to remember only the smell of lavender and the sound of a gentle singing voice. Her father had left behind a deed to a parcel of land in the Kansas Territory, something he had won in a card game and never done anything about, something he had tucked into a tin box beneath his bed with the vague intention of going west someday, always someday, and then someday had run out on him. Julia had stood over that tin box for 3 nights before she made her decision. She had a cousin in St. Louis who kept offering her a room in exchange for domestic work, and there were men in the city who had made polite inquiries about her situation, men who looked at a woman without family or income the way a merchant looks at discounted goods, with calculating interest rather than genuine regard. Julia Townsend had looked at her father's deed, looked at the map, and decided she would rather build something of her own in a wild and uncertain country than become a convenient fixture in someone else's comfortable life. She arrived at the land agent's office on a Tuesday morning and was told, with the particular brand of condescension reserved for women who had the audacity to show up without a husband, that the deed was valid, that the land was roughly 60 acres near the Walnut River south of a growing settlement, and that she was absolutely free to go and do whatever she liked with it, with the unspoken implication that whatever she liked would amount to nothing at all. Julia thanked the man, gathered her information, and began organizing her passage west. The wagon train she joined departed from the edge of the settled territories in late September. It was led by a trail boss named Emmett Crane, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a gray-streaked beard and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. There were 11 wagons in the company, carrying families mostly settlers bound for homesteads, a pair of brothers going to join their father's cattle operation, a widow named Mrs. Harriet Bloom who was relocating to live near her son, and then there was Julia, alone in a small hired wagon, her modest possessions packed into 3 trunks and covered with oilcloth against the rain. She met Walter Sawyer on the second day out. He rode in from the south on a dark bay horse, pulling a second horse loaded with supplies, and Emmett Crane rode out to meet him at the edge of the camp with the comfortable familiarity of 2 men who had known each other long enough to skip most of the pleasantries. Walter Sawyer was 28 years old, though he carried himself with the measured deliberateness of someone considerably more seasoned. He was not a large man by the standards of the frontier, but he was lean and capable-looking, with broad shoulders and hands that were weathered and scarred in the way that spoke of actual labor rather than decoration. His hair was dark and slightly longer than fashionable, pushed back under a battered hat that had clearly survived considerably more than one season, and his jaw carried a few days of dark stubble that he seemed largely indifferent to. He was a scout. Emmett had hired him to ride ahead, read the land, and keep the train from blundering into trouble. And trouble, in 1873 on the Kansas plains, came in several reliable varieties. Weather, terrain, water shortages, the occasional opportunistic band of outlaws who watched wagon trains the way hawks watched open fields. Julia noticed Walter Sawyer the way she noticed most things, carefully, from a measured distance, cataloging details with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned early that observation was often the most practical form of self-defense. She noticed that he spoke little, listened carefully, and that when Emmett Crane asked his opinion on a root question that first evening around the fire, every head in the circle turned toward him with a quality of attention that was given rather than demanded. She also noticed that he had not looked at her once. This was not unusual. Julia was a reasonably handsome woman. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned under a practical bonnet, gray eyes that tilted slightly at the corners, and a face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty, with good bones and an expression of self-possessed intelligence that some men found appealing and others found unsettling. But wagon trains were not social occasions, and the trail had a way of flattening a person down to their usefulness. And in those first days, Julia was largely focused on keeping her wagon's rear wheel from developing the alarming wobble she had noticed on the second morning, and on trying to determine whether her supply of dried beans would carry her through to the settlement without supplementation. The days fell into their rhythm. Up before dawn, harness the horse, roll with the train, make camp before the light died. The Kansas plains in late September had a particular quality of beauty that was vast, and somewhat merciless. The grass had gone gold and amber. The sky was the kind of deep, unbroken blue that seemed to press down on the land. And in the evenings the light turned everything the color of old copper before the dark came rushing in cold and complete. Julia found herself drawn to it despite the discomfort, despite the dust that got into everything and the ache in her lower back from the wagon's hard seat, and the persistent anxiety of a woman traveling alone in a country that did not particularly concern itself with the welfare of women traveling alone. She had her first real conversation with Walter Sawyer on the 5th day out, when her horse, a calm older mare she had named Daisy for her cooperative temperament, threw a shoe on a stretch of rocky ground and came up lame. Julia had pulled her wagon out of the train's line to avoid blocking the others, and she was crouching in the dust examining the mare's front left hoof with a worried expression when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find Walter Sawyer pulling up beside her on his bay horse, scanning the situation with quick, practical eyes. "Stone bruise," he said, dismounting before she had a chance to speak. "I believe so," Julia said, standing and brushing dust from her skirt. "I noticed she was favoring it about a mile back." He crouched where she had been crouching, lifted the hoof with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times and examined the sole carefully. "Not too bad. She'll need to rest it tonight. You can walk her slow for the rest of today's distance and she should be better by morning if we poultice it." Julia looked at him. "Do you carry poultice materials?" He glanced up at her briefly. "I do." He lowered the hoof gently and stood. "I'll bring some to your camp tonight." He was back on his horse and riding to rejoin the front of the train before Julia had quite finished forming her reply, which she found simultaneously practical and faintly aggravating. She was not accustomed to conversations ending on someone else's terms. That evening he appeared at her small fire with a tin of the prepared poultice and showed her how to apply it and wrap the hoof properly. And while he was doing this, Julia watched the careful efficiency of his movements and the way he spoke to the mare with a low, steady murmur as he worked, and she asked him how long he had been scouting for wagon trains. "For years," he said, not looking up from the wrapping. "Before that," a pause. "Cattle drives. Before that, the army." Julia recognized the brief quality of that particular answer. It was the tone of someone who had put something down and did not particularly want to pick it up again, and she did not press it. Instead, she said, "I appreciate you stopping today. Most of the others would have kept moving." He finished the wrapping and straightened and looked at her for what felt like the first real time, and she had the peculiar sensation of being seen clearly and without judgment, the way a horizon is seen. "You were managing it yourself," he said simply, and then he took his horse and walked back toward the main camp, and Julia stood by her small fire for a long moment looking after him before she shook herself and went to bed. Over the following week, they spoke in small, practical increments. He would stop by her wagon briefly at the end of a day's travel to report the next day's terrain or water situation, brief and informative, and Julia would respond with questions that were pointed enough that, gradually, the conversations began to run a little longer than was strictly necessary for the transfer of information. She learned that he was from Ohio originally, that he had a brother somewhere in Colorado he corresponded with occasionally, that he had been to Texas twice and had no desire to return, and that he thought the Kansas plains were the most honest landscape in the country because they hid nothing. "Most people find that frightening," Julia said one evening when he had offered this last observation. They were sitting on opposite sides of her small fire, and the sky overhead was an extravagant arrangement of stars that the light pollution of cities had hidden from her all her life. All that open space with nowhere to conceal yourself. "Most people are hiding something," Walter said. Julia looked at him across the fire. "And you?" He met her eyes, and there was something in that look that was direct and slightly raw, as though her question had landed somewhere more personal than he had expected. "I've tried," he said after a moment. "Never been particularly good at it." She smiled at that. It was one of her real smiles, not the polite social arrangements she had deployed in drawing rooms, but the actual one with warmth in it. And she saw, very briefly, something shift in his expression before he looked away toward the dark plain, and she filed it away quietly, the way she filed away important things. The trouble began in the second week of October. The weather came down from the north with the particular viciousness of an early plains winter, not snow yet, but temperatures that dropped to near freezing at night, winds that cut through even the heaviest coat, and a sky the color of dirty pewter that pressed down on the world with an implacable weight. Two of the wagons at the rear of the train had axle problems from the increasingly rough terrain, and slowing to accommodate repairs stretched the day's travel to a frustrating crawl. Emmett Crane had the tight-jawed look of a man doing arithmetic that was not adding up properly. The supply situation was also tightening. The train had started with adequate provisions, but a river crossing 10 days back had been rougher than anticipated, and one of the supply wagons had lost a significant portion of its cargo to the current. What remained was divided among the company, but the shares were thin, and growing thinner as the cold made everyone's appetite sharper, and the slower pace stretched the days between here and the settlement. Julia had been careful with her own provisions from the beginning. She had 3 weeks of sensible, unexciting rations: dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, hardtack biscuits, some dried apples, and a small supply of coffee that she considered as close to medicinal as anything she was carrying. She had been eating carefully, portioning her meals with the methodical discipline of a woman who had grown up in a household where waste was not tolerated, and she believed she had enough to see herself through if nothing else went wrong. Then her wagon's rear wheel, the one she had been worrying about since the second day, finally gave up its quiet suffering and failed entirely on the morning of October 14th, shedding a spoke and cracking the rim on a stretch of frozen ground that seemed to have been placed there specifically to end her patience. The wagon tipped. Not dramatically, not a complete rollover, but enough. Enough that her trunks shifted, that her box of provisions slid and struck the side wall with a sound like a gunshot, that her carefully organized food supply scattered and was partially buried under the weight of her clothing trunk before she could write anything. When she finally got the wagon level with the help of 2 of the other settler men and opened the provision box with shaking hands, she found the cornmeal bag split and ruined, the coffee tin intact but with a crack in the lid that would not seal, The biscuits partially crumbled into fragments but mostly usable. And most critically, her salt pork gone entirely, rolled out of a broken corner panel and lost somewhere in the grass. She stood for a long moment in the cold wind, looking at what remained, and did the arithmetic with the specific focused calm she applied to situations where panic would be expensive. She had perhaps a week's worth of reduced rations. The settlement was, according to Emmett, still 8 to 10 days out, perhaps more given their current pace. The other families had their own shortfalls, and she would not ask them for charity before she was absolutely forced to. She repacked what she had, set her jaw, and drove her repaired wheel, which one of the brothers, a decent carpenter, had patched enough to hold back into the line. She did not tell anyone about the extent of her situation. This was partly pride and partly practicality. Telling people you were short on food in a company that was itself already stretched thin accomplished nothing, except making everyone anxious. Walter Sawyer had not been present for the wagon accident. He had ridden ahead that morning to scout the next water source, and he returned in the early afternoon. Julia watched him pull up alongside Emmett and exchange words, watched Emmett's expression tighten and Walter nod with the calm of someone delivering bad news he has already accounted for, and thought nothing specific of it until that evening. The camp that night was quieter than usual. The cold had intensified, and people retreated to their wagons earlier, and the fires were kept small against the wind. Julia sat at hers with her blanket pulled around her shoulders, eating a very small portion of biscuit and bean broth that was more water than bean, and trying to read by firelight. She had brought 2 books, a decision she was deeply grateful for, when she heard footsteps and looked up. Walter Sawyer stood at the edge of her firelight with his hat in one hand and his usual expression of measured attention, but there was something in the set of his jaw that was different from his ordinary composure, something that had a question in it. "You lost provisions this morning," he said. It was not quite a question. "Some," Julia said. He looked at her. He looked at the thin broth, the small scrap of biscuit. He looked at her face, and she had the distinct impression that his read of the situation was considerably more accurate than she had intended. "How much is some?" Julia set her book down. "Enough to require careful management for the remainder of the journey." He stood there for a moment in the wind, and she saw him working something through behind his eyes. Then he said, "I want you to share my rations for the next 3 days. Until we reach the Cottonwood Creek camp, there's a trading post there that Emmett knows. We can resupply." Julia opened her mouth. "Before you argue," he said, in the tone of a man who has anticipated the argument and prepared for it, "I carry more than I need. Scout's privilege, Emmett supplies me separately because I cover more ground. I have sufficient for both of us until Cottonwood Creek." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes without flinching, without any quality of charity or pity in his expression, just a direct, practical offer, stated as though it were simple logistics. "I don't take things I haven't earned," Julia said. "You can pay it back at the trading post," he said. "Consider it a loan." She considered him, and the fire snapped between them, and she said, "All right, a loan. With interest, I'll cook for 3 days since you'll be supplying the ingredients." Something moved in his expression that might, on a man less controlled, have been a smile. "That's acceptable." From that point, things changed in the way that certain things change between people when circumstances strip away the protocols of ordinary social distance and replace them with something more immediate. They cooked together at her fire 3 evenings in a row, because she had insisted on that condition, and the act of preparing a meal together, even a simple frontier meal of cornbread and stewed dried beef, has a particular intimacy to it. The shared warmth of a fire, the practical conversations about proportions and timing, the small negotiations of space and preference. Julia learned that Walter Sawyer had strong opinions about coffee, that he was more patient than she had initially credited him, and that he was privately funny in a way he seemed almost surprised to discover in himself. As though his sense of humor had gotten so little exercise it had become slightly startled by its own existence. He learned that Julia was methodical and fiercely independent, and had a laugh that she seemed to ration carefully, but which, when it came, was entirely genuine and lit her face like the lamp she kept in her wagon. He learned that she had opinions about almost everything, and stated them with a directness that was, in his experience, unusual for a woman of her time and background, not as performance or provocation, but simply because she had never seen the practical value of obscuring her actual thoughts. He found this compelling in a way he could not immediately explain, and did not try to. The 3 days at Emmett's negotiated pace brought them to Cottonwood Creek on the morning of October 17th, and the trading post there was small and poorly stocked, but Julia replaced her salt pork and the split cornmeal bag, and she paid Walter back with a portion of her resupply, a transaction he tried to wave off, and she absolutely refused to accept his waving off. Pressing the flour and dried meat into his hands with the firm expression of a woman who understood that debts allowed to go unpaid had a way of turning into something more complicated. "There," she said, "we're even." He held the supplies and looked at her and said, "I don't think accounts between people are ever quite that simple." She looked up at him because she had to look up slightly, and she said, "No, I suppose they aren't." They stood there in the cold October morning outside the trading post, and Julia felt the distinct and slightly alarming recognition of a feeling she had been carefully not naming for approximately 10 days, the feeling of standing on the edge of something that could not be crossed back from once it was crossed, and she thought about her 60 acres near the Walnut River and what she was going to do with them and all the practical concerns that constituted her actual life, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer, for the loan." "Walter," he said, "please." "Walter," she said. The remaining distance to the settlement played out over 5 more days, and those 5 days had a quality to them that Julia would think about for years afterward, the quality of an approaching ending, the heightened awareness that comes when you know that what you have now is temporary, and the thing that comes next will be different. She and Walter continued to share her fire in the evenings, though the loan had been repaid, and the arrangement's formal justification had ended. Neither of them mentioned this. The conversations deepened without specifically changing their nature. They talked about the land, about the settlement, about what building something from nothing actually required, about whether courage was a thing you had or a thing you chose repeatedly in small acts throughout a day. Walter, she discovered, read more than she had expected. He carried a battered volume of essays by Montaigne in his saddlebag, of all things, and when she expressed surprise at this he said, "I had a schoolmaster who believed any man who did not read had simply chosen to be a smaller version of himself," and Julia decided she would have liked that schoolmaster very much. It was on the 4th of those final 5 days, October 21st, she would remember it precisely, because she had the habit of recording her days in the back pages of one of her books, that the moment happened which she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The morning had been harder than most. The temperature had dropped sharply overnight to what felt close to 15 degrees, and the wind came out of the northwest with a quality that was not merely cold but actively hostile, finding every gap in clothing, turning exposed skin numb within minutes. 2 of the children in the Harmon family wagon had developed coughs, and the general mood of the company had the frayed, ground-down quality of people who were simply tired of being tested. Even Emmett Crane's voice, calling the company to start at dawn, had a thread of exhaustion in it. Julia's breakfast that morning had been nothing. She had been sharing her provisions more carefully than she let on. Mrs. Harriet Bloom, the widow, had run short and was too proud to say so directly, and Julia had been quietly supplementing her meals for the past 2 days in small ways she hoped went unnoticed. By morning, her own food supply for the day amounted to 3 biscuits and a diminishing quantity of coffee, and she had drunk the coffee at dawn and put the biscuits in her coat pocket, because she found it easier to keep moving if she did not think about eating until the day's halt. By midday they had stopped for the horses, and Julia was standing at the side of the trail, stamping her feet against the cold, and trying to get the feeling back into her fingers, when Walter rode back from the front of the train and dismounted beside her with the easy grace of a man to whom a horse was essentially an extension of himself. He stood beside her, and she could see the set of his face that told her the afternoon route held some difficulty he was already managing in his head. And she wanted to ask, but she was so cold that the question required more organizing than she had available. And so they stood there for a moment in the wind that tore across the flat grass with nothing to stop it for 20 miles in any direction. And Julia was so hungry that the world had taken on a slightly distant quality. The edges of things slightly unclear, the kind of hunger that sits under the ribs and radiates outward. Walter reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He drew out a biscuit, one single biscuit, slightly crumbled at the edges from traveling in his pocket, but whole and solid and real. He held it out to her without looking at her, without speaking, without explanation or commentary or the particular quality of performance that would have accompanied an act of generosity designed to be noticed. He simply put it in her hands. And then he turned and checked his horse's cinch strap and looked out at the northern horizon, as though nothing had happened at all. Julia looked at the biscuit in her cold, clumsy hands. She looked at Walter's back. She thought about refusing it. She thought about the exact same thing she always thought about in these moments. Her independence, her ability to manage her own affairs, her determination not to be a woman who required saving. And then she thought about the absolute simplicity of what had just happened, the complete absence of condescension or theater or expectation in the gesture, the way he had turned away to spare her the discomfort of being watched receiving it, and something in her chest did something she did not have immediate words for. She ate the biscuit. She ate it standing in the wind on the Kansas plain, and it was the best thing she had tasted in her 24 years of living, and she knew, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives in the most unremarkable moments, that she was completely and entirely in love with Walter Sawyer. She did not say this. She finished the biscuit and brushed the crumbs from her hands and said, "Emmett looks worried about the afternoon weather." "We'll make camp early," Walter said, still looking at the horizon. "There's a draw about 4 miles that'll shelter us from the northwest wind. We'll be all right." And they were all right. They made camp in the draw, and the wind raged overhead while they were sheltered below it. And Julia built her fire and sat beside it in the dark with her hands wrapped around her tin cup, and her heart doing something large and unmanageable in her chest. And she thought about 60 acres near the Walnut River and what it meant to build something alone, and whether building something alone was actually what she wanted anymore. And whether a man who said nothing when he gave you his last biscuit was the kind of man a woman built something with. They reached the settlement of Hadley, Kansas, on the 23rd of October, 1873, in the early afternoon under a sky that had finally relented into pale blue and occasional sunlight. The community was young and rough-edged, a main street of 4 buildings including a general store, a land office, a forge, and a saloon, with scattered homesteads in various stages of construction spreading out from the center like an unfinished thought. But there were people there, and warmth, and the smell of food being cooked in a proper kitchen somewhere. And the Emmett Crane wagon train came into that settlement with the specific relief of people who have been tested and have passed, or at least survived. Julia Townsend filed her land claim at the office on the 24th of October, 1873, standing across the desk from a land officer named Mr. Pelham, who had the good grace to simply process her paperwork without editorial commentary about women homesteading alone, possibly because the look she gave him when he hesitated conveyed her position on the subject with considerable precision. She was given her claim papers and stood outside the land office in the pale October sun holding them. And for the first time since she had found her father's tin box, she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily and without apology, standing on the rough wooden sidewalk of Hadley, Kansas, with her claim to 60 acres in her hands, crying because her father would never know she had done it, and because she was cold and tired, and because she had made it, and because in her chest there was a knot of feeling that was part grief and part triumph, and part something else that had a name she was just beginning to acknowledge. She became aware of Walter Sawyer standing at a respectful distance, not looking at her, leaning against the post of the land office with his arms crossed and his eyes on the street, clearly having positioned himself close enough to be there if she needed something and far enough away to give her her privacy. She wiped her face. "You don't have to stand watch," she said. "I know," he said without moving. She looked at his profile, the set jaw, the quiet steadiness of him, and she said, "What are your plans now the train's delivered?" There was a pause. He said, "Emmett's heading back east in 3 days. I'll ride with him to Fort Dodge. There are usually trains forming up for the winter drive by November." He paused again. "You'll need help getting your homestead started before winter sets in properly." Julia folded her claim papers carefully. "I'll manage," she said, and then, because she was a woman who believed in honesty and was also standing on a sidewalk having just cried in public in front of a man she was deeply in love with, "But I would not object to help." He looked at her then fully, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen there before, not the careful composure, not the professional attention, but something open and uncertain and quite a bit more vulnerable than she expected from him, and she thought that this was the expression of a man who was also standing on an edge. He said, "I could delay leaving by a few days." "How many days?" Julia said. He seemed to be doing some kind of internal calculation. "As many as you need," he said, and his voice had something in it that made the words carry more than their surface meaning, and Julia Townsend looked at Walter Sawyer in the October sun and understood that they were not really talking about fence posts and winter preparation at all. "Then I suppose you should come and see the land," she said. They rode out to her 60 acres that afternoon, Walter on his bay horse and Julia on her newly shod mare. And the land was exactly what it was, flat and cold and bare, and full of potential. 60 acres of Kansas grassland running down to the curve of the Walnut River on its southern edge, with one scrubby cottonwood grove near the water and the remains of a previous settler's attempt at a structure, 4 stone foundation walls, waist high. Abandoned for reasons Julia chose not to dwell on too specifically. The sun was low and yellow, and the grass was gold, and the river made a quiet sound in the cold air. Walter walked the perimeter while Julia stood by the cottonwoods and watched him. He was reading the land in the way she had come to recognize the slight attention in his posture, the way his eyes moved between the ground and the horizon and back, assessing slope and drainage and shelter with the methodical intelligence he brought to everything. He came back to where she stood. "Good land," he said. "Enough water. That stone foundation is worth keeping. Someone did good work on those corners." "I intend to build on it," Julia said. He looked at the foundation and then at her and said, "I can help with that. I know how." And so it began. Walter Sawyer did not leave with Emmett Crane 3 days later. He sent word with Emmett to the Fort Dodge contact that he would be delayed, and he began each morning by riding out to Julia's land with tools borrowed from the Hadley forge and later purchased at the general store, and they built. It was not a romantic endeavor in the conventional sense. It was cold and physically demanding and occasionally frustrating, and Julia quickly discovered that she had significantly underestimated how much she did not know about practical construction. And Walter discovered that Julia was the most rigorous student he had ever taught anything, asking pointed questions until she understood exactly why each thing was done the way it was done and not merely how. They raised walls, roofed the main room with lumber hauled from the settlement's mill with Daisy's considerable help, hung a door that actually closed properly, chinked the stone joints with clay and grass to keep the wind out. In the evenings they sat by the fire Julia had established inside the stone walls, A proper hearth Walter had built on the third day, pronouncing it with evident satisfaction when it drew cleanly, and talked. They talk the way people talk when something is building between them and both of them know it, and neither quite has the courage to name it directly yet, circling the actual subject by talking about everything adjacent to it. What she hoped to grow in the spring, whether he had ever considered something other than scouting, what she thought the settlement would look like in 10 years, whether he had any interest in cattle since her acreage could support a small herd. It was on the 11th day, she knew because she had kept counting, that he finally named it. They were at the fire, and it was evening, and the wind had died for once into a particular quality of plain stillness that felt almost like held breath, and Julia had made a proper bean stew with salt pork and a biscuit recipe she had been improving since the trail. Walter had eaten with the sincere appreciation of a man who had been subsisting on road food for 4 years and had nearly forgotten what a real meal tasted like, and afterward they sat in the comfortable silence that had developed between them, the kind of silence that is full rather than empty. "Julia," he said. She looked at him. His face in the firelight had that quality she had seen on the sidewalk in Hadley, the open and uncertain thing beneath the composure. "Yes," she said. "I left Ohio because there was nothing there for me that I could build something from," he said slowly, choosing the words with the care of a man who did not speak casually about important things. "I've been moving since I was 19 years old. Cattle drives, army, scouting. I thought the moving was the thing. The work." He looked at the fire. "I've been thinking lately that maybe the moving was just what you do before you find the thing." Julia's heart was doing a great deal of complicated activity, but her voice was very steady. "What thing?" He looked at her directly. "The thing that makes staying make sense." The fire shifted. Outside, the Kansas night was vast and quiet and cold and completely indifferent to the two people sitting inside a stone-walled room on a 60-acre homestead. But Julia did not feel the cold or the vastness or any of the indifference. She felt only the particular warmth of being looked at honestly by someone who had earned the right to see her clearly. "Walter," she said, "you gave me your last biscuit 3 weeks ago and said nothing about it." He blinked slightly, as though this specific observation was not what he had been anticipating. "I have thought about that," she said, "more than about anything else I can remember for 3 weeks, what it meant, what a person has to be made of to do a thing like that without any ceremony about it." He was very still. "It was just a biscuit," he said, but his voice was not casual. "It was not just a biscuit," Julia said, "and you know it was not just a biscuit." He said nothing, but the expression on his face was answer enough. She said, "I think you should stay." He said, "Julia." She said, "I think you should stay, and I think you should help me build this place into what I mean for it to become. And I think you should do it because you want to, and because this land means something to you the way it means something to me. And not because of any other reason, not obligation or proximity or loneliness, because I am none of those things and I will not be the reason a man makes a choice he doesn't truly want to make." The fire. The silence. Walter Sawyer looking at Julia Townsend with an expression that had moved entirely past careful control into something raw and decided. "I want to stay," he said. "That's the whole truth of it. I want to stay." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she smiled, the real one, the one with warmth in it, and she said, "All right then. Stay." He stayed. He stayed through November and into December, and the homestead grew. The main room became a proper cabin with 2 windows purchased from the settlement and glazed against the winter, a floor of tamped clay and river sand, a second room partitioned for sleeping, a linta for Daisy and his bay horse, which had been stabled at the settlement at considerable weekly expense and was very pleased to come home. Julia planted nothing yet. The ground was too cold, but she laid out her garden in her head and on paper, walking the land and thinking about what would go where, and Walter listened to her plans with the focused attention of a man who was investing in something he intended to be part of. They were not yet what they were becoming. There was a careful propriety between them. Walter had taken a room at the settlement for the nights, riding out each morning, because Julia had her reputation to consider in a young community where people were still taking each other's measure, and because he was, in the fundamentals of his character, a man who did things in proper order. But in the hours between morning and evening, there was a growing ease and warmth between them, the comfortable fluency of two people who had learned each other well enough to move without collision in a shared space, and the occasional moments when their hands met passing a tool or a cup had a quality of electricity that neither of them was imagining. He kissed her on the 16th of December, 1873. It was evening, later than usual, because they had been working to finish the linta before a predicted snowfall, and the first soft flakes were beginning to fall as they stood in the doorway of the completed shelter, watching the horses settle into their fresh hay. Julia was shivering slightly despite her coat, and Walter stood close beside her, and she turned to say something about the snow, and he was looking at her in the way he had been looking at her for weeks, and she stopped saying anything at all. He raised his hand and touched her face, the cold of his fingers and the warmth of his palm together, and he said, very quietly, "May I?" And Julia, who had never once in her life waited to be asked before saying what she actually wanted, said, "Walter, I believe you should have done this at least 10 days ago." He laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, low and warm, and then he kissed her in the doorway of the horse shelter, while the first snow of winter fell soft and quiet on the Kansas plain, and it was, Julia would later tell her children with complete and unashamed conviction, the single best moment of her life up to that point. They were married in February of 1874. The wedding was held in the parlor of the Hadley settlement's only substantial house, belonging to a family named the Caldwells who had arrived 6 months before Julia and had built accordingly, with a circuit preacher named Reverend Hooks officiating. The gathering was small. Emmett Crane had made the trip from Fort Dodge, which moved Julia more than she expected, and Mrs. Harriet Bloom was there with her son and his family, and the brothers from the cattle operation had ridden down, and a handful of the Hadley settlers who had become, over the winter months, something approaching neighbors. Walter's brother, Henry, received a letter in Colorado but was too far to travel. He sent a reply that arrived the week before the wedding that was warm and funny and expressed considerable pleasure at the news, saying that it was about time his brother stopped pretending to be a man who needed nothing. Julia wore her best dress, a dark blue wool with a fitted bodice that she had brought from St. Louis and saved for a significant occasion, now defining this as the most significant occasion she was likely to encounter, and she carried a small bunch of dried wild grasses because there were no flowers in February in Kansas, and she thought dried grasses were a far more honest bridal bouquet for a woman building a homestead on the plains anyway. Walter wore a new shirt that he had purchased from the general store with evident care, and his hat, as always, and when she walked across the Caldwell parlor toward him, he looked at her with an expression that contained everything he was not the kind of man to say in a room full of people, and she understood all of it completely. Reverend Hooks pronounced them husband and wife, and the gathered company applauded, and Emmett Crane blew his nose loudly and pretended he had dust in his eye, and Julia Sawyer kissed her husband in front of everyone without a trace of self-consciousness, and felt the full weight of how much her life had changed in 5 months and was not afraid of any of it. The homestead filled out through that first spring with the particular velocity of transformation that comes when winter breaks on the plains, and the world, which has been holding its breath under ice and cold for months, suddenly releases everything at once into green and warmth and motion. Julia planted her garden with the focused intensity of a woman who had been planning it in her head since November, vegetables along the south wall of the cabin, herbs in a raised bed near the door, and a small field of winter wheat that she and Walter seeded together in March when the soil finally allowed it. Walter, with no more trains to scout and no intention of returning to that work, applied himself to the homestead with the same methodical effectiveness he brought to everything. He expanded the lean-to into a proper small barn, acquired 3 cattle from a drover who was selling off surplus stock at Fort Dodge, began the process of fencing their acreage in the sections that needed it. He was also, Julia discovered to her great pleasure, a considerably more social creature than his trail manner had suggested. Once he was in a place that was his own, with people he had chosen, the measured reserve softened into something warmer and more at ease, and he and the neighboring families developed the cooperative relationships that the frontier made both necessary and natural, sharing labor for large tasks, trading skills and supplies, building the kind of community that a settlement like Hadley needed to survive. Julia contributed to this with the particular currency of her own skills. She could sow and preserve, and she had a natural facility for the practical negotiations of community life, and she was not afraid to speak plainly in the community meetings that began that spring, when there were enough established settlers in Hadley to need some form of mutual governance. She was the only woman who regularly attended those meetings. This was not universally welcomed. There was a man named Gunder Mast, a large Norwegian with strong opinions about the proper ordering of things, who made his views about female participation in community governance known in terms that were both pointed and condescending, and Julia addressed him on the matter in the middle of a community meeting with a precision that left the room briefly very quiet and Gunder Mast looking at his boots. Walter, who had been watching this from across the room, caught her eye afterward with a look that had an entire conversation in it, specifically the conversation that said, "I have married the most formidable woman in Kansas, and I am extraordinarily pleased about this." She told him that evening, "I am not going to stop attending." "I know," he said, "and I am not going to change what I say when I am there." "I know that too," he said. "Julia, I think Gunder Mast has already understood that in a fairly complete way." She laughed, and he pulled her close in the way he had, with a naturalness and a security that she had not known she was missing until she had it, and she rested her head against his shoulder in the firelight and thought about her father's tin box and the $32, and the land agent's condescension in St. Louis, and all the miles and cold and hunger between that moment and this one, and felt a gratitude so large and specific it almost hurt. Their son was born in January of 1875. He arrived on a Wednesday in the deepest cold of the winter, delivered by a frontier midwife named Mrs. Cook, who had strong hands and a calm that Julia found immensely stabilizing during the 12 hours that preceded his arrival, while Walter paced the outer room with an expression that Mrs. Cook later described as a man who would gladly walk into a gunfight, but has completely lost his composure over something he cannot personally solve, which Julia found both accurate and deeply endearing when she heard it. They named him Thomas, for Julia's father. Thomas Walter Sawyer, born January 8, 1875, on 60 acres of Kansas homestead that his mother had claimed from nothing, and his father had helped build into a home. He was a healthy, loud, thoroughly red-faced baby who from the first day operated on the principle that his needs were the primary organizing fact of any room he occupied, and Walter held him in the hour after his birth with an expression that had entirely abandoned all composure and was simply and openly wonder, the kind of wonder that a reserved man feels when something breaks through all his careful defenses and finds him completely unprotected. "He looks like you," Julia said from the bed, watching her husband hold their son with the particular concentration of a man learning something new that matters enormously. "He looks red and furious," Walter said. "I hope that's temporary." "That part is you," Julia said. He looked at her over the baby's head with such warmth and such helpless love that she had to look away because it was almost too much to hold, all that feeling in one room. Thomas grew through his first year into a sturdy, curious child with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and an apparently bottomless interest in anything that moved or made noise, or was in any way not where it was supposed to be. He was walking by 11 months, a development that Julia observed with pride and Walter observed with the practical concern of a man who had just finished installing a proper floor and was now watching it put to very energetic use. The homestead continued to expand. Walter added 2 more cattle in the spring of 1875, and a second field was put into wheat, and the small garden became a substantial kitchen garden that supplied not only their own table, but produced enough surplus that Julia began selling preserved goods at the settlement's small market, a practice that started as supplemental income and gradually became something more significant as Hadley grew, and the demand for good preserved food in a frontier community proved reliable. Julia kept records careful, precise records in ledger books she ordered from a St. Louis catalog of everything: the farm's income and expenses, the crop yields, the livestock figures, the household accounts. She had a facility for figures and a rigorous mind that did not let comfortable assumptions substitute for actual arithmetic, and the homestead prospered under this discipline in ways that it might not have under a less methodical management. Walter understood and respected this completely. He had no particular interest in the accounting himself. His gift was physical and spatial, the ability to look at a piece of land or a construction problem and understand immediately what it needed, and the division of these domains between them had developed naturally and efficiently without either of them having to negotiate it formally. He trusted her judgment on the financial and organizational matters with absolute completeness, and she trusted his judgment on the land and the animals and the building with the same, and together they were considerably more effective than either would have been independently, which was, Julia thought, probably the actual definition of a good marriage. Hadley grew through 1875 and into 1876 with the momentum of a settlement that had established enough stability to attract more families. A proper school was organized in a building that the community raised collectively in the fall of 1875, and Julia was central in this effort. She had strong views about education, rooted in her own experience of what an educated woman could accomplish and how sharply different that was from what an uneducated one was limited to. And she served on the school committee with the same focused energy she brought to everything she believed in. There were difficulties, as there always are. The winter of 1875 to 1876 was brutal, worse than the previous 2, with snowfall that came in November and barely let up until March, temperatures that dropped to depths that cracked wood and froze water in covered barrels, and required constant vigilance to keep the livestock alive. Julia and Walter weathered it in the way they had learned to weather difficulties, together, systematically, without panic, supporting each other through the long weeks when the horizon was white in every direction and the cabin walls were the whole world. There was also the question of the land itself and the broader injustices of the era. The plains that Julia and Walter were building their life on had belonged, in living memory, to the Cheyenne and the Osage and other peoples who had been systematically pushed from their territories by the same westward movement that had brought Julia and her father's deed and the other settlers to this place. Julia was not unaware of this. She had read enough and observed enough on the trail, the remnants of old encampments, the names on the land that predated the settlers by centuries, the occasional encounters with displaced individuals in the settlement who had nothing and were treated with a contempt she found deeply uncomfortable. To understand that the homestead she had built stood on a complicated foundation, that the story of the frontier was not only the story of brave settlers building something from nothing, but also the story of peoples dispossessed and stripped of a way of life that had sustained them for generations. She talked about this with Walter, who had seen more of it than she had. He had been through enough of the southern plains and the territories to understand the systematic nature of what was happening, the deliberateness of it, and he did not dress it up when they talked about it. They agreed that living honestly meant acknowledging it, that gratitude for what they had did not require pretending it had come without cost to others, and that whatever they could do in their specific sphere, treating every person with basic dignity regardless of what most of their neighbors did, they would do. In the spring of 1876, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy moved differently than Thomas's had. She was more tired in the early months, and there was a period in April when she had such persistent nausea that Walter took over the morning farm tasks without being asked, and with such matter-of-fact competence that Julia found herself watching him from the cabin window, with a love so physical it was almost dizzying, thinking that of all the things she had done in her life, finding this man was the one she was most grateful for. Thomas, now 16 months old and deeply committed to the project of becoming a person of consequence, was an energetic presence throughout all of it. He had developed an attachment to his father that expressed itself in a determination to do everything Walter did to follow him to the barn, to stand with him at the fence, to sit beside him in the evenings with his own small stick, while Walter worked on harness repairs, practicing the motions with intense concentration. Walter bore this devotion with a warmth that was one of Julia's favorite things to watch, the care with which he explained things to a child too young to understand the explanations, the patience with which he answered the same questions repeatedly, the way he made the child feel always, that his presence and his questions were genuinely welcome rather than merely tolerated. Their daughter was born in November of 1876. They named her Margaret Ann Sawyer, Margaret for a graytan of Walter's who had apparently been a woman of considerable character, and Anne for no specific reason, except that Julia liked how it sounded with Margaret and thought a daughter should have a name that could stand on its own. Margaret arrived with considerably more efficiency than Thomas had, and with immediately different energy. Where Thomas had been loud and declarative from the first moment, Margaret looked at the world from the beginning with her mother's gray eyes, and a measuring expression that Walter said was going to be extremely inconvenient in about 15 years. "She already looks as though she knows more than we do," he said, on the evening of her birth, holding her while Julia rested. "She probably does," Julia said. "That's what daughters are for." The letter from Walter's brother Henry arrived in the spring of 1877, and with it came the information that Henry had a working cattle operation in Colorado that was doing well and that he had been trying, for some time, to convince a particular neighbor to sell a connecting piece of land that would make the operation substantially more viable. He was writing to ask whether Walter would be interested in coming to Colorado to look at a partnership opportunity, because he trusted Walter's eye for land and cattle more than anyone else he knew, and because, he wrote with characteristic directness, he was fairly certain his brother had been telling himself he was a scout when he was actually a rancher waiting for the right place and the right reason to stop moving. Walter showed Julia the letter one evening after the children were asleep, and she read it by lamplight with Thomas's crayon drawings on the table beside her and Margaret asleep in the wooden cradle Walter had made the previous winter, and when she finished she looked up at him and said, "What do you want to do?" He was watching her with that careful expression that meant he was being genuinely uncertain rather than performing uncertainty, and he said, "I want to know what you think. This is your homestead, Julia. You built it from a tin box and $32 and sheer will. I am not going to ask you to walk away from it for my brother's opportunity." Julia set the letter down and actually thought, the way she thought about important things, not quickly, not impulsively, but with the full attention of her practical mind. She thought about 60 acres and what they had made of it, and she thought about what 60 acres would always be, and she thought about a cattle operation in Colorado and what that could become. She thought about Thomas and Margaret and what kind of land and life they would grow up in. She said, "Henry's right that you're a rancher. I've known it since I watched you look at my land the first time we came out here together. You read the grass and the water like a book. Walter said, I could be a farmer here. You are a farmer here, Julia said. A good one, but there's a difference between what a person can be and what they were made for. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, there's also the question of what you were made for. Julia smiled. I was made for building things and making them work. I can do that in Colorado as well as Kansas. The silence between them was the comfortable, working kind. Outside, a night bird called once and fell quiet. We would keep this land, Julia said. I want to keep it. We can lease the farming to a family that needs the ground. There are 2 young families in the settlement that are land poor. And then it's here if we need to come back, or for Thomas and Margaret when they're grown. Walter looked at her for a long moment. You've already thought all of this through, he said. I think through everything, Julia said pleasantly. You know this about me. He laughed, and she loved him completely, and they wrote back to Henry. And by August of 1877, the sale of a leasing agreement for the Walnut River homestead had been arranged, and the Sawyer family, Walter and Julia and 2-year-old Thomas and 9-month-old Margaret, packed their wagon and set out for Colorado. The journey was, in many ways, the inverse of Julia's first Western journey. She was not alone, not short on provisions, not cold and uncertain in an unknown country. She had a husband who read the land and her moods with equal accuracy, 2 children who made traveling both considerably more complicated and considerably more joyful, and the particular confidence of a woman who had already crossed a difficult country once and knows that she can do it again. There were hard days. There were days when the wagon was hot and the children were fractious, and the water was farther than expected, and Julia ached from the hard seat in the way she had not let herself complain about on that first trail, because she had been too focused on appearing capable, and now she did not have to pretend. She could say, Walter, my back is killing me, and he would stop at the next suitable place and they would rest, and he would do the thing he did, the quiet laying of his hands on the place that hurt, the steady pressure that he had somehow learned without being taught. And the pain would ease, and she would lean back against him for a moment in the afternoon sun, and think about the first trail and the girl she had been on it, and feel the difference between then and now, like the difference between standing in the cold and standing by a good fire. Henry Sawyer was a taller version of Walter, with the same dark hair running toward gray at the temples and the same quality of unhurried competence, and a wife named Clara who was a small, energetic woman of 32, who immediately took Julia's measure with the sharp eyes of someone who had been waiting to meet the woman who had finally given her brother-in-law a reason to stop wandering, and who had clearly been hoping for exactly this. She and Julia liked each other from the first hour, which Walter noted with a relief he did not entirely conceal, and which Henry noted with a satisfaction that expressed itself in a very brief nod in his brother's direction that somehow communicated, well done. The Colorado land was magnificent. Julia had not expected to be undone by it after Kansas, but Colorado undid her, the scale of it, the way the plains ran up toward mountains that stood on the western horizon like the edge of the world, snow-capped and enormous and permanent. The ranch land itself was in a valley with a creek running through it, and grama grass that Walter walked through on the first afternoon with his hand trailing at his side, and a look on his face that was as close to naked emotion as Julia had ever seen from him. She stood beside him in the grass and said nothing, and he reached over and took her hand without looking at her, and they stood like that for a long time in the Colorado afternoon, while the mountains went pink and then purple in the setting sun. The partnership was formalized in September of 1877. Henry's operation, now legally the Sawyer Brothers Cattle Company, had 22 cattle and reasonable range. Walter brought money from the Kansas lease agreement, and more importantly brought the knowledge that had been accumulating in him through 4 years of reading the land across the Western Territories. And the 2 of them and their families settled into the practical work of making something substantial. Julia ran the household accounts for both families, because Clara freely admitted she had no head for figures and no interest in developing one, and also took on the schooling of Thomas, and eventually the neighboring ranch children in an informal arrangement that would, in another year, lead to the establishment of a proper schoolhouse in the valley. This was Julia's doing. She organized it, wrote the letters to the territorial board, found the books, identified the teacher. It was the kind of project she attacked with the same energy she had brought to every other building project of her life, because she understood that you could raise excellent cattle and still be building something incomplete if you did not also build the things that made a community actually worth living in. The winters in Colorado were their own variety of demanding, but the valley had good shelter from the worst winds, and the ranch house that Walter and Henry built in the fall of 1877 was solid and warm and large enough for the purposes of two growing families. Because Clara, as it turned out, was expecting her first child in the spring. Thomas Sawyer discovered horses in Colorado in a way that he had not quite been able to in Kansas. The ranch's remuda was a revelation to a 3-year-old who had been interested in animals since he could walk, and Walter, watching his son's eyes go enormous at the first sight of the string of working horses in the corral, began a deliberate, patient project of introducing his boy to the fundamentals of horsemanship that was one of the longer-running pleasures of his life. Thomas had his father's patience and his mother's absolute determination, and by the age of 5 he was riding his small pony with a confidence and an ease that made Henry Sawyer, watching from the fence, say to Walter, "That boy is going to break your heart when he rides out of here someday. He's that natural." Margaret, meanwhile, was developing in the direction that Walter had predicted on her birthday. She was observant, verbal, and in possession of a will that required a great deal of creative channeling, and Julia undertook this channeling with the recognition of one strong-willed woman encountering another in small form. She read to Margaret every evening from the books she had carried from St. Louis and ordered from catalogs and traded with Clara, and Margaret sat through these readings with an intensity that was gratifying and slightly unnerving. She seemed to be memorizing things, storing them up in the same way Julia stored information, and at 4 years old she began asking questions that required actual thought to answer properly. "She is going to be something," Clara said one evening, watching Margaret interrogate her father about why the creek ran south and not north, Walter answering with complete seriousness, while Henry watched the exchange with entertained helplessness. "She is already something," Julia said quietly, watching her daughter and her husband at the creek bank in the evening light, the mountains going dark behind them. In the spring of 1879, Julia and Walter's third child arrived, a second son, whom they named Eli James Sawyer, after no one in particular except that the name seemed to suit him before he was an hour old, which Walter maintained was the only reliable way to choose a name. Eli was a calm, cheerful baby who seemed genuinely pleased to be present, and who developed a smile by 6 weeks that his father was completely helpless against. The household, already full and warm and loud, accommodated him with the easy expansion of a family that has found its rhythm and knows how to stretch it. The cattle operation grew. By 1880, the Sawyer Brothers Cattle Company had over 100 head, working range that extended into the Upper Valley, and a reputation in the territory for good stock management and fair dealing. Walter had become known in the wider ranching community as a man whose word held, and whose eye for cattle and land was worth considerable in actual terms, and this reputation brought the kind of business relationships that good operations need: access to the better markets, reliable partnerships with other ranchers, the confidence of buyers who came back because they trusted what they were getting. Julia, for her part, had become the kind of woman a new country produces. When it gives a strong one room to grow, she was involved in the school, in the territorial women's suffrage petitions that circulated through the valley in 1880, in the community organizations that were the bones of civilized life in a young settlement. She wrote letters with the same precision she brought to everything, and she argued for the things she believed in with the directness that had always been her way. And she was widely respected and occasionally found extremely inconvenient by people who preferred women to be decorative rather than functional. She did not care in the slightest about being found inconvenient. She had determined this position long ago in a land agent's office in St. Louis, and 6 years of frontier life had not softened it. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, she and Walter had the hours that she counted among the truest gifts of her life. The fire, the lamp, the simple domestic companionship of two people who had chosen each other fully and continued to choose each other every day in the small ways that actual love is made of. He read his Montaigne and the agricultural journals that came from the East. She read and kept her records and occasionally wrote the long letters to Henry and Clara, or to Harriet Bloom, or to old Emmett Crane, whose correspondence had become one of the regular pleasures of her year. They talked in that way they had always talked, thoroughly, honestly, about everything. And the quality of those conversations had deepened over the years into something she could not imagine being without, the specific nourishment of being fully known by someone and knowing them in return. One evening in the fall of 1880, sitting by the fire with Thomas's drawings spread on the table and Margaret's small shoe that needed new lacing in her hand and the sound of Eli's breathing from the back room where all 3 children slept, Julia looked across at Walter, who was reading by the lamp, and she said, "Walter." He looked up. This was still one of her favorite things about him, the complete quality of his attention when she spoke, the way he was never half present. She said, "Do you remember the 14th of October, 1873, he thought for a moment. Somewhere north of the Cimarron Cutoff, cold morning, northwest wind. You gave me your last biscuit," she said. "You put it in my hands and said nothing and turned away." He was quiet for a moment, watching her. "I have thought about that moment more than any other moment in my life," she said. "More than the first time you kissed me, more than our wedding, more than any of it. Because it was the first moment I actually saw you. Not who you were trying to be or what role you were playing, I saw what you were made of." Walter set his book down. The fire moved between them the way it had in those first evenings in the stone-walled cabin she had built from her father's deed and $32, and his face had the same quality it had in those evenings, the composure that was real and not performed, and beneath it the openness that she alone had reliable access to. He said, "It was the most important biscuit I ever held." She looked at him. "You knew, didn't you, even then?" A pause. "I thought it was possible," he said carefully, in the way of a man who does not claim more certainty than he actually had. "I thought you were the most remarkable person I'd encountered in 8 years of moving through a country full of remarkable people, and I knew that I would rather be hungry than watch you be hungry, and I knew that meant something significant. It was the moment I knew," Julia said. "I want you to know that. I have never told you precisely, and I want you to know." Walter Sawyer looked at his wife across the hearth fire of their Colorado ranch house, with their 3 children sleeping in the back room and the mountains outside dark against the stars and all the years they had built together present in every corner of the room, and the expression on his face was the same one she had been storing up carefully since the sidewalk in Hadley, the open, unguarded, fully present expression that was the truest version of him. He said, "Julia Sawyer, you have been the making of me." She said, "We have been the making of each other." They sat in that quiet for a long time, the fire burning low, the lamp casting its warm circle, the night outside vast and cold and full of stars in the way the western sky always was, enormous and indifferent, and somehow, tonight, exactly right. The years continued to move in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because no years are, but with the particular quality of a life that has been chosen deliberately and built with genuine care. Henry and Clara's family grew, and the two families remained as close as the ranch partnership required and somewhat closer than that, because the children were companions and the adults were friends, and the valley had become home in the full meaning of the word. Emmett Crane visited in the summer of 1881 and ate at Julia's table, and told stories about the trail that Thomas and Margaret listened to with enormous eyes, and he looked around the ranch and the house and the family assembled at the table, and said to Julia privately, before he left, "Your father would have been proud beyond words. Beyond words, Mrs. Sawyer." Julia had taken his weathered hand in both of hers and thanked him, and she meant it more deeply than she could say. Thomas grew into a young man who was, as Henry had predicted, a natural horseman, and also his mother's son in intelligence and his father's in steadiness, a combination that made him, at 16, an extraordinarily capable person who was beginning to talk about range management with the seriousness of someone who intended to do something with the ideas. Walter listened to these conversations with the expression of a man watching his best work grow beyond him, which Julia thought was probably the finest thing a parent could feel. Margaret, at 14, was learning everything available to learn in the Valley School, and asking for books that the school did not have, and writing letters to East Coast academies, with her mother's complete support and her father's quietly terrified pride, because he already knew that his daughter was going somewhere large, and he was entirely prepared to watch her go and entirely unprepared for the feeling of it. Eli, at 9, had developed a passion for drawing that had begun with the pencils Julia kept for the ledger books and expanded into something that covered every available surface and suggested a different kind of future than either of his siblings. And Julia ordered drawing supplies from the St. Louis catalog and hung his work on the wall of the ranch house with the same respect she would have given any work well done. In the autumn of 1882, Walter and Julia rode out alone to the upper range on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of October afternoon that seemed specifically designed to show the Colorado Valley at its absolute best, clear and golden and enormous. They rode to the high point of their land, where on a clear day you could see the mountains in one direction and the plains extending toward Kansas in the other, the whole country laid out with a scale and clarity that never entirely stopped being staggering. They dismounted and stood at the top of their particular piece of the world, the horses grazing on the autumn grass behind them, and Julia looked out over the valley and the ranch and the mountains, and thought about a tin box under a bed in St. Louis, and a land agent's condescension, and a cold October trail, and a man who had put his last biscuit in her hands without a word. She took Walter's hand without looking at him. He closed his fingers around hers, warm and certain, and they stood like that in the afternoon light. "Are you happy?" she asked, not because she did not know, but because she liked hearing him say it. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man consulting something genuine rather than reaching for the convenient answer. Then he said, "I am more than happy. Happy is a weather condition. What I am is," he paused, searching. "What I am is certain. For the first time in my life, I know exactly where I am and exactly where I want to be, and they are the same place." Julia turned to look at him. He was looking out at the mountains, the same profile she had studied on the trail, older now, marked by the years in ways she knew by heart, the lines at the corners of his eyes from reading the distance, the small scar on his jaw from a fence post in the winter of '76, the gray that had come into his dark hair at the temples and which she had decided privately made him look distinguished in a way that suited his character. He felt her looking and turned to meet her eyes, and she saw everything she had ever needed to see there. The man who had handed her his last biscuit on a cold Kansas trail without ceremony or expectation, who had stayed when she asked him to stay, who had built alongside her and learned alongside her and argued with her and laughed with her and held her in the dark of every hard winter and looked at every good morning beside her, who had been the unmovable ground beneath her feet through every version of her life since that trail. "I love you, Walter Sawyer," she said, because sometimes the most important things need to be said plainly. He smiled that smile, the one that was fully his, that she had been watching develop and deepen for almost a decade, and said, "I have loved you since a cold day on the Kansas plain when I realized that there was a woman in this world who could manage her own affairs and still let herself be taken care of, and that those two things together were the most extraordinary combination I had ever encountered." "That is a very long sentence for you," Julia said. "I've been saving it," he said. She laughed, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood on their high ground in the Colorado afternoon, with the whole world spread below them and the whole future still ahead of them, and the past, the tin box and the trail and the stone walls and the snow and the biscuit, most especially the biscuit, making a foundation beneath them that was solid and real and entirely their own. The years settled around them like something earned. Julia Townsend Sawyer kept her ledgers and her letters, her school committee and her petitions, her garden in the summers and her reading in the winters. Walter Sawyer kept his cattle and his range, and his steady care for the people and the land in his charge, read his Montaigne in the evenings, and taught his sons and his daughter the things he knew, and never stopped being the man who would give you his last biscuit without a word and turn away, so you could receive it with your dignity intact. Thomas Sawyer eventually did take over a significant portion of the range management, his conversations with his father becoming, over the years, the conversations of two equal ranchers rather than father and son, though the respect between them ran in both directions and never diminished. He married a young woman named Ruth, the daughter of a neighboring family, in the spring of 1893, and brought her to the Valley Ranch with all the wholehearted investment of a man who had grown up watching what a good marriage looked like, and had therefore known exactly what he was looking for. Margaret Sawyer went east to study, as she had been intending to since she was 14, and came back to Colorado with a teaching certificate and ideas about education that she proceeded to apply to the Valley School with the same systematic energy she had brought to everything since she had been 2 years old, measuring her father with her mother's eyes. She remained close with both her parents in the way of a daughter who has been given the resources to go anywhere and has therefore chosen, with full understanding of the choice, to stay near home. Eli Sawyer became an artist, which surprised no one who had watched him cover the ranch house walls with drawings from the age of 9, and his work eventually traveled farther than any of them, had gone to galleries in Denver and Chicago, landscapes of the Colorado range that carried the specific quality of someone who had grown up inside that light and understood it from the inside. He sent his parents reproductions of everything, and Julia hung them beside Thomas's childhood crayon drawings and Eli's childhood pencil sketches in the same wall of the same ranch house, because she believed in the full record of a life. In the later years, when the children were grown and out in their own lives, and the ranch house was quieter, Julia and Walter found the life they had been building toward all along, the life of two people who have made something real together and know it, and can sit in the quiet of what they've made without needing it to be anything other than exactly what it is. They still talked in the way they had always talked, thoroughly and honestly and at length, about the land and the family and the books they were reading and the world that was changing around them in ways both alarming and hopeful. They still argued, because two people with strong minds and genuine views do not stop arguing, but the arguments had the quality of good arguments, productive, honest, ending in the kitchen rather than the cold. Julia still kept her ledgers with the same precision she had brought to every set of accounts since her father's tin box, and she still attended every community meeting worth attending, and she still received the news of each grandchild. Ruth and Thomas's daughter arrived in 1894, healthy, and announcing her presence with considerable volume, and Walter held her in the ranch house kitchen with the same expression of helpless wonder he had worn holding Thomas 30 years before. Only this time he was crying without the slightest attempt to conceal it, and Julia stood beside him with her hand on his back and did not say a word, because some moments needed no commentary. On a November evening in 1895, Julia sat at her usual place by the fire in the Colorado ranch house, with her last ledger book open on her knee, and the lamp burning, and the sound of Walter in the kitchen making the coffee he had taken over making every evening with an efficiency she attributed to his having strong opinions about how it should be done. She looked around the room, the wall of drawings and paintings, the Montaigne on the shelf, the 2 books she had carried from St. Louis that were now battered nearly to dissolution but still present, the view through the window of the Colorado night, and the mountains darker than the sky. She looked at all of it with the particular vision that comes with years, seeing not just what is there now, but everything it had been, and everything it had cost, and everything it meant. The whole accumulated weight and warmth of a life built deliberately from very little in a country that had asked everything of her and given everything back. Walter came in with the 2 cups and set hers beside her and settled into his chair and picked up his book, and for a long moment they were simply what they had always been, 2 people in a firelit room in their home at the end of a good day. "Walter," she said. He looked up. She said, "I was thinking about October of 1873. He smiled. He knew exactly what she was thinking about. He always did when she looked at him that way. He said, "Still, always," she said. "I will be thinking about it when I am a very old woman. It was the biscuit that started everything. The biscuit that said everything. 1 biscuit and no words, and that was the whole story." He looked at her across the fire, this man who had ridden in from the south on a dark bay horse in September of 1873, and had somehow, in the long good fortune of her life, become the whole of what home meant, and he said, "The whole story." She lifted her cup. Outside, the Colorado wind moved through the valley, and the mountains stood dark and permanent against the stars, and inside the ranch house the fire was warm and the lamp was bright, and every thread of their life together was drawn, closed, and held, complete, whole, exactly as it was meant to be. Julia Townsend Sawyer drank her coffee and looked at her husband in the firelight and was, in the fullest possible meaning of the word, entirely content. She had come west alone with $32 and a deed, and the kind of courage that does not know yet what it costs, and she had built her 60 acres and her stone walls and her Colorado life. And in all of it, all the cold mornings and the hard winters and the good harvests and the children's voices and the arguments by firelight and the long evenings of honest conversation, in all of it, the thing she carried most carefully was a moment on a Kansas plain in the autumn of 1873 when a quiet man had pressed his last biscuit into her hands and said nothing, and she had understood everything. She remembered it still. She would always remember it. It was, in its small and wordless way, the whole of the story.